Sri Lanka is facing an economic crisis. It's running out of food and people are lining up in droves to get fuel. There are blackouts, school exams had to be stopped because they didn't have money for paper. The people are protesting. The president's house was ransacked and people were raiding his house, drinking his wine and eating his food. Sri Lanka's leaders have fled the country and large international institutions have stopped borrowing money. The country itself is laden with tons of debt and is actively losing money. A lot of industries which help Sri Lanka make money are broken. So why is this happening? It all started with these men. They are the Rajapakasas, the people ruling Sri Lanka. They were democratically elected, but their popularity has waned. The Rajapaksa government has gained a lot of support since the civil war, but their economic policies were widely disliked. In 2018, Sri Lanka experienced a constitutional crisis. President Sirisena appointed Mahinda Rajapakasa as prime minister before kicking out Ranil, the incumbent prime minister. This meant that Sri Lanka had two prime ministers at the same time. This was definitely illegal, triggering mass protests against the government, and in 2019, the movement culminated in bombs exploding in Sri Lankan hotels and churches, killing plenty of people. The government had worse problems. It was importing more than it was exporting, draining their foreign reserves. The government needed more money. So in 2019, Sri Lanka's government gave tax cuts to businesses and people, hoping to stimulate their economy so they could get more money to fund the government. But it didn't work. The opposite effect happened. The tax cuts had lowered government revenues. After the Easter bombings, Sri Lanka's tourism industry, which was one of the main money makers of the country, was shaken. Then as tourism picked up in 2020, the pandemic happened. The fear of contracting the virus was so strong that plenty of countries closed their borders. People were not allowed to travel in or out of plenty of countries. So virtually overnight, Sri Lanka's tourism industry went from bad to worse, with no one coming in to spend foreign currency to bolster Sri Lanka's foreign reserves. In 2021, Sri Lanka was still trying to find something to cut spending on so they could save money. Then they realized that they actually spent $400 million on fertilizer imports, so the government decided to ban all chemical fertilizer imports so they wouldn't have to pay those $400 million. This would safeguard their foreign reserves. At least that was what the government thought. Surely, forcing the entire country to start farming organically using sustainable methods sounds wonderful at first, but the reality is Sri Lanka's bid to become the world's first organic farming nation was a pipe dream. The ban on fertilizers came too soon. Farmers instantly knew their crop yields would drop severely if they stopped using those harmful but profitable chemical fertilizers, so they protested. The government chose to ignore farmers' pleas, believing the farmers to be less intelligent than itself, and forcibly imposed organic farming throughout the country. The result was a shit show of epic proportions. The amount of produce generated by the company dropped. Sri Lanka's once profitable tea industry was under threat. Farmers couldn't grow enough food to feed the country. They even lost money. A lot of farmers just abandoned their plots of land because of how futile it was to continue growing plants or food on them. The government ended up spending a lot more money than they had originally planned to save. The government's plan to save money had backfired. Sri Lanka's thriving tea industry was hit by the irrational organic policies too. After the government drive to go organic, growing tea became 10 times more expensive and only half their crop yields. The foreign reserves that the Sri Lankan government was trying to save by not spending any more dollars was dwindling, because now they had to spend $450 million to feed the 22 million Sri Lankan people. International conflicts affected the Sri Lankan economy adversely as well. The Russian-Ukrainian war worsened the economic buying power of both Ukraine and Russia. This was horrible to Sri Lanka. Russia was Sri Lanka's second largest buyer of teas, while Sri Lanka's tourism sector was surprisingly dependent on Russians and Ukrainian tourists. This meant as the Russian-Ukrainian war raged on, more than a quarter of Sri Lanka's usual tourists didn't turn up to spend their money. This is bad because tourism accounts for 10% of Sri Lanka's GDP. They can't afford to lose their tourist revenues, but they did. The pandemic did a lot of lasting damage to how Sri Lankans got their food as well. After the pandemic, supply chains were disrupted and inflation impacted economies across the globe. Sri Lanka was not an exception to this cruel new reality. Food prices in Sri Lanka skyrocketed, along with plenty of other everyday groceries. Because of inflation, people now had less money to spend on basic necessities and food, which was going up in price, all because of factors that the government couldn't control. The Sri Lankan government was trying to save money, but the country's coffers eventually ran dry. Sri Lankan ran out of money, and it was forced to borrow money from foreign institutions to continue funding public services. The food supply problem was not the only decision that brought Sri Lanka to its current crisis. The Sri Lankan government were horrified by their dwindling funds that they made a lot of horrible decisions. Their foreign reserves could not be allowed to fall to nothing. Foreign reserves are important for countries. For most countries, their foreign reserves are made up of the US dollar. They are there to prop up the local currency. Foreign reserves are also used to pay for imports into Sri Lanka. Many companies and countries do not like to trade in the Sri Lankan rupee because it is false volatile. Plenty preferred to settle transactions in tried and trusted US dollars. Sri Lanka never made enough food for itself to begin with, so these foreign reserves were important because the government used it to import a lot of things, food, chemical fertilizers, and many other things into Sri Lanka. Because the country was incapable of producing these items themselves in sufficient quantities to preserve their foreign reserves, the Sri Lankan government stopped not only the fertilizer purchases but also fuel purchases. The pandemic triggered a slew of economic problems which caused a fuel shortage worldwide. Sri Lanka in particular was severely hit by fuel and electricity shortages. The government had to enforce power cuts daily to save on electricity. Soldiers were sent out to supervise long gas station queues in case things turned violent. Sri Lankan authorities advised all internal airlines stopping at Sri Lankan airports to stock up on their own fuel beforehand. Because the country had none to spare, restaurants and bakeries shut down across the countries and many couldn't cook in their own homes because they didn't have fuel. People can be seen queuing up for both food and fuel in Sri Lanka frequently. Medicine shortages are also plaguing Sri Lankan hospitals. Sri Lanka cities lose electricity up to 15 hours a day, though the number has recently dropped to 3 hours a day, allegedly according to Sri Lankan government sources. Another factor which brought Sri Lanka closer to its downfall was the remittance crisis. Every year, Sri Lankans working overseas send money back home to Sri Lanka through remittances. Billions of dollars are sent back to Sri Lanka each year. The money remittances brings into the country is substantial. You could say remittances are the key pillars of the Sri Lankan foreign reserves. It was how the country got their dollars and other foreign currencies. However, remittances back to Sri Lanka dropped to a 10-year low of $5.4 billion in 2021, for good reason too. Sri Lanka's economy is tanking and the Central Bank of Sri Lanka made a horrible mistake which drove remittances away. Sri Lanka had a problem. It was running out of money, so the government printed a lot more money to spend without depegging the Sri Lankan rupee. The rupee was dropping fast because of the government interventions and they wanted to stop foreign reserves from depleting, so they had to solve their problems fast. To do this, the government kept their Sri Lankan currency pegged at 200 Sri Lankan rupees to the dollar. This meant that any money sent home to Sri Lanka would be converted at the 200 rupees per dollar rate. However, outside of Sri Lanka, the market value of Sri Lankan rupees was actually 240 rupees per dollar. So why would any Sri Lankan citizen working overseas exchange their hard-earned dollars for a lower price in Sri Lanka? The majority of them used unofficial channels to exchange their dollars at a higher 240 rupees per dollar instead, while others saw the ridiculous discrepancy in prices and just held on to their dollars. This caused a massive problem to Sri Lankan banks. Less Sri Lankans were sending back their dollars and other foreign currencies to Sri Lanka. So now the Sri Lankan banks ran out of foreign currency and their foreign reserves, which were made mostly out of dollars, decreased. Remittances, money sent back to Sri Lanka, were cut in half in early 2022. The Sri Lankan Central Bank fought back, wanting banks to stick to the 200 rupees per dollar conversion rate. The government attacked unofficial black market remittance services which did not adhere to its strict 200 Sri Lankan rupees per dollar rule. The government threatened to freeze bank accounts of Sri Lankans working overseas who sent money back through informal forex brokers or other illegal channels. All this damaged trust in the Sri Lankan bank. They tried to repair the mistakes by offering remittance incentives and also by unpegging the rupee's exchange rate to allow it to depreciate against the dollar, which was good, but it was not enough. Less people were sending money back home to Sri Lanka and the country's foreign reserves dried up. People had lost trust in the Sri Lankan banking system. Then in April 2022, as food inflation was nearing all-time highs, massive protests took place in Colombo, the capital city of Sri Lanka. Protesters were fed up with Sri Lanka's government mismanagement of their country. Government officials were quitting. Over 20 of them quit within a single day. The situation prompted the finance minister, the one who should be fixing the situation, to quit too. The Prime Minister Rajapakasa vowed that he would never resign and tried to shift the blame, saying that the Sri Lankan crisis was not his fault. The Sri Lankan people were starving and couldn't feed their children. They had no fuel or electricity, so they wanted the president to resign. The protesters got their wish a month later. There was a heated clash between anti-government protesters and supporters of the Sri Lankan government. The controversy forced the Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapakasa to flee the country. Police had tried to stop the hordes of people stampeding into the Rajapaksa's private residence, but there were simply too many people. Police had no choice but to just stand there and look on. The Sri Lankan demonstrators were seen partying in Rajapaksa's pool, turning his home into a public gym, going through his clothing, eating his food and drinking his wine. Some had picnics on the compound, and others slept on his bed and took selfies to rub it in. The ex-Sri Lankan Prime Minister was right to be scared. He knew what would happen to him if he resigned in Sri Lanka. The protesters had a valid reason to hate him, so he flew to Singapore where it was safe before sending in his resignation through email. Sri Lanka's coffers has finally dried up, and they have no money to pay for their debts. After Sri Lanka's default on its debt payments, no one in the world wanted to lend money to the country. Rating agencies downgraded Sri Lanka's sovereign debt bonds to junk status. Sri Lanka had been cut from its lenders. The government had no choice but to dig into their foreign reserves and use the money to pay down their debt, cutting its foreign reserves down to $2 billion we see today. Not all of the money in the foreign reserves can be used. Currently, only $50 million can be used freely, explaining why they defaulted on a $78 million loan payment in May 2022. Sri Lanka's debt is a sizable amount, reaching over $51 billion. Currently, Sri Lanka is trying to negotiate with the IMF to get a loan to bail it out. Just getting the loan won't solve all its problems. IMF loans are famous for their austerity cuts, and governments hate it because the IMF conditions will limit their spending, devalue the country's currencies, and make life harder for them. The International Monetary Fund has not agreed to any loans yet, saying that Sri Lanka has to discuss its debt restructuring talks with China first because it owes the country a lot of money. Before Sri Lanka hammers out a deal with China, the IMF loan negotiations won't be completed, as Sri Lanka's government won't receive any loans to save their country from its current nightmare. Hopefully Sri Lanka sorts this out with its debt holders and gets the loans they need to get the country back on track. Like and subscribe.